Thank you for being here, Megan. I'm like always so grateful to you because I know you do not have to do this and you just do it out of the goodness of your heart because you care about the community and you care about everyone in it. So thank you for being here.
Of course. I'm super happy to have this conversation.
Oh my gosh, this conversation. I feel like this is like one of those things that like doesn't get talked about like nearly enough in the coaching space. Which is that often like people feel like running a team is harder than running your business. Like I know so many of my clients, like as they grow and scale, a large portion of the conversations we're having a lot of the time is around team and team management and things like that. And there's so much conversation around how like team is great, team helps you scale, team helps you do all these things, and it does, but there is a lot of like challenges that come with that. So we just want to talk about what to do, how we handle that, how to think about it in your business, because it's like a real serious thing that I don't think gets talked about enough. It's almost like team's great, it's fine. It's like it is, and right? Does that feel true for you, Megan?
Totally. I feel like it's one of those things like there's so many, with everything, there's always a trade-off, right? And the same is true for team. There are always going to be different things that come up. And a lot of the time you don't even really realize what goes into managing a team until you're actually in it. And that's when some of these things that we're going to talk about kind of come up and you have to kind of figure out how to manage that in your own way too.
For sure. And I think like we almost, how do I want to say it? Like we feel like, so a lot of people will like interview and they'll interview for a skill set and they feel like, okay, well, I'm just hiring a contractor that has a skill set. They're going to come in, they're going to do their skill set and that's it. And we like really don't think about it like that. We really think about it as like, we're hiring a personality, we're hiring a person, and we're hiring for a team. And so I just want to like say that as an important thing too, because I think it can be easy to listen to this and be like, oh, I don't really have a team, or like, I just need someone to like post my social media shit or whatever. And it's like, that's still a team. And part of making that easy is treating it like that instead of being like, why do I keep getting all these shitty contractors? Like, that's not the thing, right?
Totally. Yeah.
So if you guys have questions, obviously Megan, I don't know what side of me she's on. Obviously Megan is here. I think she's this way to answer them. So feel free to put them in the chat, but we're just going to talk through kind of like how we do communication, how we handle challenges, and kind of like how to think about stuff. So in terms of communication, I'll kind of just share from my end a little bit, and then you can share from your end because I think it's so helpful to hear both. But what I have really learned, I think a lot of you guys have heard my stories that I went through. How many did I go through? Like 5?
I don't know.
Maybe 6, 5?
It was a lot.
A lot of VAs before I hired Megan. And I really felt like that. Like I felt like, well, I'm hiring this skill set and they should be able to figure it out and it should not be this hard kind of thing. But the thing I wasn't doing was just overly communicating what I wanted and what my needs were. And Megan and I kind of already had a relationship when I hired her. So it was so much more natural for me to communicate with her. But that was also what was missing all along to a certain extent. And this is a conversation I have with my clients all the time and that I work on all the time, is being absurdly clear, right? Like I even reached out and told Megan something this morning that like we had already talked about. She already knew how I felt about it, but it's like I'm always trying to like over communicate, and not in a way of like being annoying, but in a way of being like, if I expect her to know this, like it's my job to directly communicate it, probably more than once even, because sometimes it'll feel like, well, that should be so obvious. But like, think about it like this, like the people we're hiring are also working for a bunch of other people that work and think in entirely different ways than we do. So one of the main things that has made this work, and that has been like a huge tenet for me, is just to be ridiculously clear and over communicate every single thing. So to the point of like, hey, I love it when you ask me questions like that. Definitely feel free to keep asking me that. Or like, hey, you never have to ask me again, just decide. Or like, hey, when that comes up again, I'm just going to end up Googling it myself. So what you need to do is just Google it. Like that level of specificity. And it's almost like with my clients, I call it like fighting the good fight. to a certain extent, which is like, you can like ignore all of that and not say anything because it takes the extra time to like over communicate or be super clear or give really specific directions. And you're like, I don't have time to give that much clarity every single time. But if you don't do that on the front end, you're going to pay for it on the back end. So I can give a lot more examples there, but just curious, like, to hear your thoughts on that, Megan.
100%.
You guys are here. Say hi. I see some of you watching. Thank you
hi
for
guys.
being here. We like get into it and then we're like, oh, yeah.
I know. Well, and I don't have Facebook pulled up. So like, I can't, like for me, I'm like, I'm just on a Zoom call with Lacey. So you tell me when you see comments.
Hi. Tell us what you're doing.
But yeah, I totally agree. I think that like, generally speaking, I typically try to just like over communicate things that even if it seems obvious, like I feel like that is just so helpful too, because then there's just also not a question. I feel like, I feel like so often sometimes we're like, oh, well, I assume that this person knows something, or I assume that this is the right answer. But I think that it is just so important to always have that clarity. And just even if it's one time, even if it's like, hey, I'm assuming that this is probably what you're going to say, but let me just double check. And just to have that level of clarity in your communication allows like between you and your team members on both ends, allows both of you to just understand each other better, right? And I think that it allows things to just move more smoothly because you're kind of having that clarity on the front end rather than having to like something happens and then you have to like back it up and figure out like, well, where did the breakdown happen? So I feel like if you kind of over communicate up front, be so much easier on the back end. And I think that like if you over communicate to your team up front, your team's going to have like better questions for you too. Like they're going to get stuck on things still. Of course, everyone does. Like there's still going to be questions that come up, but the questions are going to be more precise and more specific and just kind of like higher quality questions that are easier to answer and easier to go through, right? Does that make sense?
Totally. Natalia said she loves this conversation because she's expanding her team now. That's awesome. So yeah, I think like from an onboarding perspective, that's really helpful too. Cause I'll tell you, like, I can see that in my clients and I can see how they have like totally different preferences sometimes. So it's like, some of my clients are like, ask me all the questions. If you need to message me 10 times a day, ask me as many questions as you need to. Let's get it right before we move forward. That's totally fine. That's just like a certain desire that they have, and that's cool. Some of my clients are the exact opposite. They're like, do not fucking message me. Take as great of a guess as you possibly can. It will be fine. If we have to clean something up on the back end, great. But imagine that you're the team member and you're working for different people that are on all different ends of that spectrum between like, ask me a bunch, don't ask me a bunch. Like, you have to be the one clearly communicating to them what you want, or it will be impossible for them to meet your need. And then you'll be like, oh, they're like a crappy team member. They don't take initiative, or they make a ton of decisions without my approval or whatever. And it's like, that's maybe because another client of theirs loves that. Right. And so something I work on with a lot of my clients is to almost have like I don't know, this feels like cheesy to say, but almost like company culture kind of rules to give when somebody onboards. Like, we value Googling, we value asking questions and getting the right answer, or like we value being a self-starter and doing research and making your own best guess. Like, whatever that is for that client, and it looks different for every client, but just having almost like this idea of like, what is the best thing? Like, Megan knows, like, I would much rather her just decide. And then if we like have to clean something up, we clean something up. But she knows that. So we work super well together like that, where with some of our team members, Megan definitely does not want them to decide. She wants to be asked. Like, we're a little, like, we have different pieces in that. And so just being able to like clearly identify, and I think Natalia, especially if you're like bringing on more team, can you give them like the 5-point synopsis of that, of how you want them to communicate with you, how you like to be communicated with? Like, that is ridiculous ridiculously helpful, I think, because then you can see if they're actually stepping up to the plate for that or not, versus like, you know, them thinking they're doing a great job by asking you 32 questions and you hating it. And like, you guys just aren't on the same page at all. Right, Megan? What is your thought on that?
Totally. And I think that like, I think it's also just kind of important to talk about like what communication looks like too, because I think that it has to kind of look differently for different people and stuff. But like, we have a combination between me and Lacey, and with each team member, there is a combination between regular like phone calls or Zoom or whatever, but touching base on a scheduled call regularly, and also having some type of like chat, right? Where we can just like message each other in between calls. And I just think that that is also so important because one, it helps you build that relationship and actually like create more connections with your team members. They get to know you better, you get to know them better, a little bit outside of just like business specific things as well. But also I think that you can just have different types of conversations on a phone call or in chat, right? Like, I think that the things that come up and the conversations that you can have are just so much different. And I think that it's so often people have a much easier time communicating of like, hey, I really want you to feel free to do X, Y, and Z, or I'd really rather if you didn't do this and you came to me first or whatever. I feel like so often those types of things are really useful to do on calls. And I think that that's why we have those regular calls with different team members, you know?
Yeah, I think that's so important. I feel like to go back to that idea of like team can be such a hard point for people. Sometimes this is the reason why, because I can think of a couple clients who have like been struggling with a team member, and I've been like, well, when's the last time you had a call with them? And they're like, I don't know, months. And I'm like, okay, that has to change. That's the first thing that has to change, because that is a completely different conversation than like we're messaging back and forth and I'm like messaging you quickly when I need something or whatever. Like, no. Natalia said, do you recommend weekly meetings with your team members? I don't think you have to. Like, Megan and I have a bi-weekly. Is that right?
Monthly?
We meet twice a month. Holy fuck. I don't know. We meet twice a month. That works really well for us. I think even just like a once a month meeting could work too. It's just like, are you having those touch base points with your people? Megan, what do you feel like about that?
I think it also depends. So typically like I'll meet with a team member more often at the beginning, like to kind of help with the onboarding process. So I think that that is one thing to consider. I also think that it kind of depends on what is happening within your business. Like if you have a ton of projects going on, you are launching something, you might need to meet more frequently.
For sure.
But if it's something where you're just kind of like a regular, like you have things going on, but it's only like a few projects at a time, and you don't have to meet every single week. So I think that part of it is also just figuring out what that looks like, because it can be different with each team member as well. You know, like you might need to meet with your graphic designer like once a month or every other month versus, you know, with your VA who's kind of in your business all day, every day type of thing more frequently. So I think that, you know, kind of feeling it out, because I think too, when you have conversations, like when you actually meet, it's going to be clear. If you're like, hey, so we have nothing to talk about, maybe we should spread out these meetings more, like a little bit more, or hey, we had an hour blocked out and we have so many things that we still haven't covered, let's schedule another call type of, you know.
For sure. And I also think like there's a difference between like, are you having one-on-one meetings versus are you having a total team meeting too? So I think that's something to think about, where the cadence of those might be different. Like maybe you're having weekly like team meetings where everyone's on the same page, but maybe you only need to like individually meet with everybody once a month or something like that. So that's something to think about too, where it's like, there's a difference in terms of like one-on-one, but I highly recommend the one-on-one meetings, even if you are having the larger team meetings, because that will make such a difference, I think, in terms of like forming that relationship and really having that team member, I think, feel like they're part of something bigger and part of what you're doing. I think that that is really, really crucial, where I feel like sometimes in like team roles, that team member doesn't even like see the big picture or doesn't feel like it's important what they're doing. And they're just like less likely to do a great job at it, honestly. Jackie said, I've had great experience with team members, but I'm having some issues with a short-term contractor. And Jackie, I think that might even be a good thing to be like, how am I setting up calls with that contractor as though they were a team member? You know, because I feel like that is still like someone that's like on your team, in your business, representing it. And so even if it's short term, just like almost treating it the same, like give them that list that we talked about of like, here's how we operate, schedule those calls with them, even if it's short term. Like, I feel like that's sort of like again, like I think this keeps coming up, but it's like, as your business grows, team is the most important thing you can spend time on. And so we can almost be quick to be like, oh, I don't really need that meeting, or I really don't need that thing. I know I was guilty of that at a point in my business where I would cancel meetings with Megan sometimes because it just felt like, oh, I like have so many other things to do. And then I finally realized like, that is the thing I have to do, right? Like that is the most important use of my time. Now I like will never do that. Or if I have to move it for any reason, it's getting moved to another time that week, because it's like, I know that focused use of my time is like the leverage point for more growth. You know what I mean?
Totally. Yeah, I totally agree. I think that like prioritizing those connection points and prioritizing your team pretty much like even this is kind of going to go off into a side tangent, but even in like response times, like, and I'm curious to hear your perspective on this too, but I feel like I don't think that you need to be like in constant communication with your team and available 24/7 or anything like that.
Yeah.
But I do think that having some type of system, again, going back to the communication piece and what your expectations are and what team can expect from you as well.
Yeah.
Of like, you know, so for me personally, like I have a hierarchy essentially of like, my team can expect a response from me usually within a few hours. But if they need an immediate response for something, then they know how to contact me separately, right? And I think that things like that can be really useful so that team can understand like how quickly to expect a response, whether it's a few hours, whether it's 24 hours, whatever that is, but having that expectation, and then what happens if they need you faster than that kind of thing, right? And what qualifies as like, oh, this is like an emergency type of thing, right?
Yeah. So something that I will just say from my perspective that I hold myself to like high accountability around is I try to respond to Megan as fast as I possibly can. We have a rule in our business that nothing's an emergency, and I don't take it in a really like, oh my God, I have to respond to her. But the reason that's such a high priority and high value for me is because I really value when my team is responsive. So I think that there's some bullshit that can happen sometimes where we feel like we don't have to respond to our team quickly, but when we want something, they better respond within like 2.2 seconds or whatever. And you guys know, I don't believe in that. I believe in even energy exchange. I believe in showing up in the energy you want other people to show up in. And so I value when Megan gives me a quick response to something. So it is a very important piece of my day that she gets quick responses. And I think you can attest to that. Like if you need something, like I'm getting it for you. I'm answering your question. I'm on it, right?
Or if you can't, you will tell me when you will get back to me. You're like on calls until X time, whatever, right? Or like, so that I at least have that expectation that I can then, and it's just useful. It's just super, super, super useful as a team member who is doing a lot of different things to be able to know when you can like expect to hear back and get the information that you need to do whatever you're doing, right?
And then you can hold your team to that. So I can say to Megan, like, so my expectation of you is that you're going to tell me the same. Like, if you can't get back to me that day, just tell me or whatever. But it's like, we forget that we're the leaders of how it goes down. So if we're taking 24 hours to respond to our team members, don't be surprised when they take the same. And that might be totally okay. That might be the setup, but it's like really like leading with what you want, I think is so important, and like showing equal prioritization. Like if I want you to really prioritize me when I reach out for something, then the same has to come back the other way. So that's, I think, a super important part of the communication is like, are you wanting your team to jump through hoops, but you're like, I'll get to it when I get to it. No, that's not going to work out. They need to feel valued first, and then they're going to value you. It's kind of that simple. And it doesn't mean that you don't have a reasonable timeline on yourself. Like, hey, I'm on calls for the next 4 hours, like whatever, but there's still like I see you and you have my attention, right? Yeah, Jackie said, yes, we had 2 calls to kick off the project. I thought I was clear enough, but I could have set official deadlines. Totally. Let's talk about that. And setting response expectations would have been good too. She didn't respond to me for 5 days. I have so much to say about that, Jackie. Thank you. Thanks, Steph. Thank you for being here. I am obsessed with clear response times. It is like the number one thing I tell all of my clients. Basically is like, if they're like, well, my VA isn't whatever responding that quickly, I'm like, what's your agreed upon response time? And they're like, and the thing is like for everyone, it's totally different. Like with, like, for example, with my clients, they know you will hear back from me in 24 hours. If you don't, it means I missed it or something has gone wrong, basically. That's so valuable because then they're never wondering. They're not like, oh, I wonder if she'll see this, or I wonder if it's going to be a couple of days, or I wonder if, and the same is true with team. Like having a clear container, whether it's 24 hours, 48 hours, 12 hours, like it doesn't matter. But I just see like our expectations vary so widely. Like one of my clients might have the expectation that someone's responding to them in a fucking hour, but their team member thinks 24 hours is like an excellent response time. And so they're just both annoyed at each other all the time because the clarity isn't there. What is your take on that, Megan?
Totally. And I think that like, that's definitely something to be setting those expectations at the very, very beginning, right? Like it should be in your contract.
For sure.
Like it should definitely be something that you are entering into the agreement, knowing that this is what that expectation is, and you are mutually agreeing upon it. And if it's something where like, you know, let's say somebody has like one expectation and somebody else like has another, then you need to have that conversation and like meet in the middle somewhere or figure that out. Otherwise, you're just not a good fit. And then you're basically, you know, kind of preventing a lot of frustration on both ends, right? And so I think that just having like, there are kind of a lot of different conversations to have before you even start, whether it's a short-term project or a long-term team member. I think that, you know, turnaround times and things like that are just some of those like basic expectations and things that you agree upon, just like it would with like your number of hours per month or responsibilities or rate or anything like that. I think it's just as important to have those conversations up front.
And same with deadlines. Like I try to never give Megan something that doesn't have a deadline attached to it, or where I'm not like, I literally don't care about the deadline at all, whatever. Like there has to be clarity there. Because unmet expectations are going to be like the absolute killer of you feeling happy with your team and your team feeling happy with you. And so the clarity around expectations takes extra time and energy, but it is like insanely useful. Megan never, ever gives me something she needs from me without attaching a deadline to it as well. Like it's mutual. Like I've never gotten a task from her that didn't have a deadline, even if it's like well, she just like lies to me now, basically, is the gist. She like gives me a deadline that's like a week earlier than I actually need to get it done. Super helpful though. Like
to be fair, you're really good at getting like at meeting deadlines, but I think that like there is something very valuable in setting deadlines and communicating the flexibility around that.
Yes.
Whether that is like, I need this by this day, or I'm setting this as a due date, but if this is not reasonable, or if you need more time, let me know, we'll talk about it. And then that opens up a discussion about the deadline.
Yep.
But either way, there is still communication around the deadline. It's not just like, oh, they'll probably get to this soon. And, you know, having no clarity on either end of when that's going to be completed, you know?
Yeah. Kim says, yes, even energy exchange is a great reminder. Natalie, oh my God, kill me. I did not mean that. I love you. Natalia said, do you honor that response times on weekends as well? I do not expect my team to work weekends ever. I think that is really detrimental to a certain extent, where it feels like they always have to be on and it always has to be a thing. Like, I think that that is, again, to the point of our rule in business, which is nothing is an emergency. I think like it's really hard for a team member to enjoy when they're supposed to be on 7 days a week. I will say that if my team reaches out to me on a weekend, I make every effort to get back to them, because it's like, if they're working on a weekend, they're really over delivering for me. Right. And so I really do make the effort there. But in terms of like expecting them to respond, I do not at all. Jackie said, yeah, like I thought since this was a short-term project, we even spoke about working over the weekend. It was highly implied. I totally see how having those expectations in writing beforehand for a project like this would have been so helpful. Such a good learning experience. Totally. And that's what it is, right? Is just like using it as a learning experience, where it's like, we think we're on the same page with people. And then when we see we're not, it's just good to be able to be like, okay, cool, moving on.
And I think you can definitely, can I just side note that?
Yeah,
I think
totally.
that you can definitely like, I don't think it's just like, oh, it's a lost cause type of thing.
Yeah.
Especially Jackie, in your situation, I don't know what the project is or anything, but like, I think that you can definitely send an email and be like, hey, I'm realizing that when we first started, we didn't set some of these expectations, and I'd love to have a conversation around that. Can we like blah, 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 right? And I think maybe like having a bullet pointed list of, here are some of the questions I have, or here are some of the things that I'd like to discuss, so that you can still have that conversation and move forward with the project, rather than just being like, oh, well, this is just how it is. No, even if it is short term, I think that it's worth, you know, reaching out and trying to have that conversation.
Totally. I love that. Steph said, oh, unmet expectations and sneaky expectations I've seen are the unraveling of many relationships. My own experience too, 100%. Mm-hmm. And I think that like sometimes, especially over time, it grates on you, and then you're not having the conversation. And then one day you're just like, I have to fire this person or whatever. And the person that gets fired is like, what the heck? So we're going to talk about that in a second too, like how to deal with challenges and when to let go of someone. But you're totally right. It's like unmet expectations over a long period of time, you're screwed. Like it gets to a point where it's hard to come back from, I think. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? When it happens for a long time. So that's another rule, is like dealing with stuff really early and really upfront. Let me just read the next thing and then we'll do that. Natalia says, oh shoot. Yes, I agree with having weekends off as well. I think it's important to unplug. Absolutely. Totally. And you know, I think that really thanking your team when they're choosing not to do that. Like if they're choosing to work for you on a weekend, just being able to be like, hey, I see you over delivering there. Thank you so much. Or whatever that is, I think is really useful, because then they like are more apt to want to do things like that. When you're like, great, I see you working on the weekend. Can you also do these 10 things or whatever else? It's like, they're going to want to avoid that more and more when you're like, oh my God, that was so meaningful to me. Here's your quick answer. Thank you for over delivering. Totally different scenario. Got something there? You're laughing.
No, I'm good.
Just in agreement.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So another thing is, well, I want to say one more piece on that just before I forget. The number one rule, basically, number one, it's also the number one rule in sales, which is no one can, your team cannot read your mind, and you cannot read. The number one rule in sales is like, you are not a mind reader. But the number one rule here is your team cannot read your mind. Like, anytime you are under the assumption that someone gets it without it being explicitly stated, that's when you're trapping yourself. It doesn't mean it doesn't take extra time, energy, and effort to be explicit, but there is nothing more important. The second you think, well, they'll get that, they must know that, they'll figure that out, they obviously are on the same page, that's when you're starting the losing game. So that's just the rule I would take away from most of that, is like, no one can read your mind, so it's your job to over communicate as much as possible. Okay. Yeah, Jackie said positive reinforcement. Totally. Okay. So next thing we were going to talk about is like how to handle challenging situations, basically. So mistakes, missed deadlines, all that kind of stuff. Megan, do you want to share your thoughts on like what to do if like you're getting a mistake or seeing that same mistake over and over again?
Yeah. So I think that the first thing I want to say here is that the way that we operate is that it doesn't matter how small of a mistake it is always pointed out. Mm-hmm. With love, in a very respectful way. It's not like oh my God, you did something wrong or anything.
We make you cry every time you make a mistake. No.
Typo. But I think that anything that happens is a conversation. We will, and I always, like, every time that we hire a new team member, we have this conversation before we even start working together of, hey, FYI, I will point out all mistakes, because that is how we learn. That is how we can correct our own mistakes. Rather, and I think that it just kind of starts to help like nip things in the bud type of thing, where like we're preventing it from becoming into a bigger issue. And so if it becomes a bigger issue, then that's another thing that we can deal with. But I think that it's just important to at least have a conversation anytime that something is done incorrectly, and to allow your team members to correct their own mistakes. And that one. And actually learn from the thing that happened, right? It could be super small. It could be, something a little bit bigger, and letting them know that like, it's okay to make mistakes. You are allowed to make mistakes in this business. And at least he still teaches me. I think that it's something that's how your team will be able to learn, and to really learn not only like the small thing that happened, but it also can illuminate things within your communication or your systems, or anything like that. It helps to shine light on why, like, what needs to change in order for that mistake to not happen again. Does that make sense?
Totally. And I think there's a big difference between like feedback and frustration. Feedback is like, hey, this little thing went out wrong. Like, can you fix it? Whatever. Frustration is like, there was a mistake made, and and they're like very different energy. And so like, it's really important to always give the feedback, because if not, how is someone ever going to fix it? But it's really important to not bring a ton of frustration with it, or that person is going to recoil almost and like stop wanting to like take steps in your business, because they're worried about getting the backlash of that. I love that Maggie says this rule, the mind reader thing, also applies to marriage too. Every relationship, the more explicit and clear we are, the better always. Totally. Yeah, Steph says 100% to the mistakes and addressing them. Jackie said, such a good point. My main team members have never made a big mistake. I normally correct the small mistakes without mentioning it though. Yeah, we definitely abide by like every single thing about. And again, not in a way of like, because you're in trouble, because you did something wrong. It's because like the way you don't make them again is you learn from it. In my old job, I fired a lot of people. And the number one rule I had was I'm never going to fire someone and have them be surprised. And I also have that in a lit up life now. So it's kind of nice to almost like have that rule. And you can even explicitly state that to your team. Like, hey, like you're always going to get feedback from me and you're never going to just like get fired and be surprised. So like Megan doesn't ever worry like, oh, I wonder if like Lisa's really frustrated with me or if like she could let me go next week, or because she knows like my standard is you'll never, ever, ever be surprised. You'll have heard from me about it 6 times. I'm just making a number up, but like whatever, 5 times before that ever happens. And so it's really helpful and comforting for your team too, to know like you're going to hear from me on every issue. Nothing is ever going to be a surprise. Like in this odd way, it gives them some safety as well. Steph said, I use the method close in person, place and time. Address something as close to the person, as close to the place it happened, and as close to the time so that it can be addressed and we don't have to create stories around the mistake. 100%. I love that. Yeah. And I think the point Megan made that I want to say something about too is like having the team member fix it. Again, this is that like fight the good fight kind of thing where it's so much easier to just fix it really quick and move on, but to take the time to allow them to address it and to have them correct it and to actually go through that process means you're not spending the next 5 months doing it over and over again. It means you took the time to handle it once. And it's probably not going to happen that much again. Or if it does, then you know that this is an ongoing problem that needs to be addressed, which is a different story kind of thing, right? But I think always bring it up and always do it just from like a neutral feedback instead of like frustration. And so if you're frustrated that somebody just made this mistake, you might have to like calm it the F down before you go talk to them. But like that's super important because that is like how they'll want to keep showing up. Like Megan said, the rule of like you can make mistakes in this business, like that is so important. Like Megan made some mistake, which by the way was like pretty much entirely my fault, but she felt like it was hers. And was like, I'm so sorry. Like, I'm going to pay for it. I'm going to like credit you hours and whatever. And I'm like, you're allowed to make a mistake that costs money in this business. Like, that's not a problem. Like, you're doing so much, like you're inevitably going to make a mistake that costs money. Like that's okay. And when you can give your team that permission, the likelihood that they make them is less. When it's like, do not make a mistake. And if you do, I will be frustrated. They might make less mistakes, but they're definitely taking less initiative, right?
Totally.
Okay, so what about if the mistake is pervasive and happens over and over again?
Well, and I think that that's also something that is important about pointing out mistakes and talking through it and, having those conversations right when it happens as well, because then you can more easily, like you can see that like the same mistake is happening over and over. And we've had these conversations, right? So it's not like, well, the same mistake keeps happening over and over, and I don't know why they're not like correcting it. Yeah. But then if you think about it, it's like, oh, have you actually talked to them about that? Have you actually had a conversation around, hey, this is a mistake. Maybe they don't even know or notice that they're doing something incorrectly, right?
Have you been willing to say it more than once?
Right, exactly. And I think that the first thing there is like, if a team member is making the same mistake over and over, the first thing is to just kind of reflect on like, what have the conversations been around this? Yeah. How have we talked about it? When have we talked about it? And were the expectations clear there? And if not, how can we make that clear, right? Yeah. And have that conversation. I think that if the same mistakes are happening over and over, my approach here is often to like bring the team member in on it and say like, hey, I've noticed that the same mistake has happened a few times now. Let's look at this thing, whatever, the task, the process, the system, how I've communicated this, how it's organized, whatever, and try to like get down into the details of it to figure out where exactly the breakdown is happening. Because often I feel like, you know, what we think the breakdown might be could be something totally different. I remember this was a long time ago, but one of our VAs had was posting the wrong images with things quite often, like happened like 3 times or something. And I was like, hey, so what's going on here? And it turned out that like the way that we had organized the graphics like didn't make sense for her, and it was confusing. And we couldn't have had that resolution without, you know, having a conversation around like why it had been happening repeatedly.
You guys know, if you've been following me for any length of time, that like the thing I'm most obsessed with is like solve the right problem. And so this is that. It's just like, how do we actually ask enough questions to figure out like, what is the right problem to solve here? Because it would have been easy in like the situation Megan mentioned to just be like, she doesn't pay attention to details, like she's annoying, bye. Right? But that wouldn't have been the right problem to solve whatsoever. And we probably would have repeated the same issue with the next person that came in who also got confused and who also used the wrong images. And like, that can slow your business down for a long time, versus taking the time to be like, let's fully talk this through. Help me fully look at the process with you and actually see what's going on here. That is, again, one of those things where like you're spending time, but it is the most valuable use of your time. Where I see business owners get themselves stuck is to be like, I don't have time to deal with that. We just need someone new who can fix this or whatever. And then they end up replacing the same role 3 times. Again, I've been there. And feeling super fucking frustrated and behind because of that. So it's like, if you just take that extra 30 minutes to jump on a call and be like, hey, this is a thing, walk me through it, you're in a totally different position. And here's the secondary piece. Say you take that time and like you come to a resolution, and then the same mistake happens again, and then it happens again, and then it happens again. You know, you did everything you could. That's like such an important thing, is like, do you feel like you did everything you could? Like anytime Megan and I have talked about a team member or them staying or whatever, that's like always the question. Did you do everything you could? Right? And I don't mean you have to like jump through hoops or whatever. It's just like, did you have enough conversations that if this isn't getting fixed, we're just not a match? Right?
And I think that that's like a really good example of when you need to take the frustration out of the situation, because like it can be really frustrating to see the same mistake happening over and over. But I think if you can like separate that and kind of get to neutral first and just be like, cool, let's look at this almost as like we're dissecting something or, you know, something like that. And just taking that stance and talking through it from that place, I think that it's just a much more useful conversation. I think that that energy creates a little bit more safety for like just open and honest conversation too, right? And so I think it's just like another example of getting to neutral being really beneficial in actually solving the problem.
Another thing Megan and I talk about a lot too is like, there's a big difference between same mistake and different mistake. This is super important. So sometimes what we do is like, if someone has made the same mistake a bunch of times, that is definitely a big issue. That's super important. That's something to address. But sometimes what happens is we almost like put this like negative spin on things, where it's like they made this mistake and then corrected it, but then they made this other mistake. And it's like, okay, but that's totally different. Like, that's not like a person issue. Again, that might be a process issue. That might be a million other things. So we really look at it like the same mistake made over and over again is an ongoing problem. A person that makes a few different mistakes is not necessarily a problem, because we're always doing new things. We're always adding to the process. We have different things going on. And so naturally, if a new process happens or if something new comes up and they make a different mistake, we have to work really hard again to get to neutral and not vilify that person and be like, well, they made a mistake last week and now they made a mistake this week. Like, okay, but like the issue isn't the mistake. It's like, do we make the same mistake over and over again? The only thing I care about on my team is that people pay attention enough to not make the same mistake a bunch of times. Doesn't mean they're never going to make another one, right? I think that's super important.
Totally.
Jackie said, it's so funny because I've been on the hired side as the marketing strategist, and I actually take extra steps to ensure I have enough info from the client every step of the way. Totally. And so cool to see how like now on the flip side, you could be like, oh, so like I can take extra steps to give that. That's so helpful. And I think that that's why, for example, Megan is so good because she's on both sides of the coin. She knows what it's like to be the one on the team and having someone communicate to her. And then she knows what it's like to be the leader. And so I feel like that's why you're so good at over communicating and stuff like that, because you know what it feels like when someone's not doing that, right?
Yeah.
What else? Let me see what else we said we were going to talk about. I want to make sure we didn't miss anything. Yeah. Oh, communication so that nothing falls through the cracks was the other thing we said. I feel like this one is very much a measure of, how do I want to say it? So like one thing out of Lit Up Life, I like legitimately do not fucking care how something gets done. I just care, like, do we have the outcome? Some of my clients care very much how something gets done. Again, it's different and either is okay. But where I think things fall through the cracks sometimes is, do you know which one of those you are? Do you want it done a certain way? Then you better document the absolute shit out of that so that nothing falls through the cracks. Or do you not care as long as you have the outcome? And have you explicitly and clearly stated the outcome, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that, I mean, that also ties into kind of like the clarification, like clear communication type of thing. I also think that like whatever your preference is around that, the way that you pass tasks to your team or write out SOPs and documentation and all of that, like the way that the team receives that information should reflect your expectations around that. So if you're like, I don't care how this is done, like the way that that's passed and the information that's given is, you know, going to should actually be reflecting that, right? If you really have a specific process or a specific like way that something is needs to be delivered or happen or whatever, then giving that like, you know, specific documentation, I think is really important.
I think also what I would say on this one too is just be willing to take accountability as the leader of that team as much as possible. So like, this is just a stupid example, but like last week we had something and Megan and I had both said like, after I do this live stream, this thing will go out. To Megan, that meant the next day. To me, that meant the next minute after I was done with the live stream. And we just, neither of us said explicitly, like we just said it will go out after. And so what I think is really important to do there is that like, if you're the leader, that always falls on you. So like that wasn't on Megan to have to clarify. She did the best she could with the information I gave her. And so this is where a team can get really frustrated. If you're like, no, it was supposed to go out then. I said it was supposed to go out after. No, I did not. That is what I said, but I did not say what after meant. And so I think just like, this is where it's like, can you hold yourself really accountable? I think people get super frustrated with their team way too easily sometimes. And like, were we both communicating? Yeah, but that was just like a misstep on my part to not say what even after meant. And the best thing I can do in that situation is be like, noted, like, great, good to know. And it was like not that big of a deal. But like, if you're kind of going to always like push that back on your team, over time, they're going to get frustrated and feel like, this isn't even worth it. Like, this is not useful. This is not like a team I want to work on. If you can always be like, yep, that was me. Like, let me take that one. It makes them want to ask more clarification questions next time, or, show up in a different way for you. So I think that's just an important thing, where I feel like, what can you take personal responsibility for in terms of when things do fall through the cracks? Like, be really, really careful not to always push off the accountability, or is that the right word? Accountability for that. You know what I mean? Responsibility.
Visibility. Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that, like, from my perspective too, it was like, I was like, oh shit, we miscommunicated about that. I should have asked a clarifying question. Let me, like, and my response was, in my brain, noted, I should clarify details on things like that, right? So I think that it works both ways too, where it's like, but had you not said something and just kind of like tossed it up, or, whatever.
It was just like silently annoyed or whatever, right?
Or if you were like, oh, it didn't go out, whatever, like, then I think that it's just kind of a lost opportunity in a way.
Totally.
You know what I mean? Because I feel like you and I, one of the main reasons we do communicate so well together now is because we've been communicating in this way for years now. And so now it feels more effortless, but we still have those different steps, and that's totally okay. And knowing on both ends that that's okay.
Yes. I think that, like, there's almost this fallacy that, like, your team should come in and make everything easier. You know what I mean? And it's like, your team comes in and makes a lot of things easier. And there's a trade-off for that. You guys know we talk about trade-offs all the time. The trade-off is you have to spend more time having those conversations. Like, this is like such a turning point I see for my clients, is when they really finally like let themselves lean in and invest, like, not just money, but actual like time, energy, and effort in team. They're like, what the fuck? This is like so good. But when they're like in that place where they've invested money, but haven't taken the time, energy, or effort piece and put it there, they almost are like making it wrong that they would have to put energy in. Like, I can't believe I would have to talk to her about this, or I can't believe I have to have a conversation about this, or like, why should I have to get on the phone all the time, or whatever. And that sticks you for so long. And when you're like, oh, okay, like, this is the place I'm going to invest. This is the most important thing I can spend my time on, is over communicating, is having these conversations, is being explicit. Like, that's when I really feel like business starts to shift and scale at that next level for a lot of people.
I totally agree. Yeah.
So good. All right, guys, this was super long. I just realized what time it was.
I know. I just looked too.
Sorry. It is physically impossible for me to do a short live stream, apparently, but this is what it is. This is why I have to do one-on-one only. I can't imagine how that would go otherwise. All right, guys, we love you. Thank you so much, Megan. I am just so grateful for you as always. Thank you for being here, for having this conversation. If anybody wants to find you, where might they do that?
You can find me at whitespace.team. My website is probably the best place to find me. That's it.
Or through me.
Through you.
If you have a question for her, just ask me. Oh, thank you, Natalia. Thank you for being here. You guys are the best. All right, y'all have a good week, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.